Take off your apron.
Now.
The sentence landed before the sound of the spoon even stopped echoing across the marble floor, a small, sharp note that somehow silenced an entire dining room, and Claire Bennett didn't move right away, her fingers still wrapped around the edge of the tray, her posture straight, her breathing steady as if the moment hadn't already chosen her as its center. The restaurant glowed in soft amber light. Rain tracing slow lines down the tall glass windows, the quiet hum of conversation fading into something thinner, more watchful, as heads turned one by one toward her, toward the woman in a simple black uniform who had just become the problem everyone could see, but no one wanted to touch. Claire had been on her feet for 9 hours, her shoes worn but polished, her hair pulled back neatly, every detail of her appearance controlled, intentional, because details were the only things she could control these days. And she had learned long ago that dignity often lived in the smallest choices. In how you stood, how you spoke, how you refused to let a moment define you before you understood it. "I'm sorry, is there an issue?" she asked, her voice calm, not raised, not defensive, just present. But the answer came not from the manager standing a few feet away, his jaw tight with tension, but from the woman seated at table 12, Vanessa Cole, who set her wine glass down with a deliberate precision that felt louder than any shout, her eyes sharp, her tone even sharper as she said, "The issue is her," and gestured toward Claire as if pointing at a stain that needed to be removed. A few guests shifted in their seats, others looked down at their plates, the quiet choreography of people choosing not to get involved, because wealth had a way of making itself known without ever needing to introduce itself, and Vanessa wore it effortlessly, in the cut of her dress, in the way she didn't glance twice before deciding someone's place in the room. "She interrupted my dinner," Vanessa continued, her voice smooth, controlled, "and embarrassed my table over something trivial." And beside her, Richard Cole leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, the faintest hint of impatience in his expression, the kind of man who didn't need to speak often because the room usually adjusted before he had to. Claire lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission but in thought, replaying the last few minutes with quiet precision. The young busboy, barely 19, his hands shaking as he cleared the table, the spoon slipping from his grip and clattering against the floor. The way Vanessa's voice had cut through the air immediately after, sharp enough to make the boy freeze, and Claire stepping in, just one step, just one sentence. "It's okay, I'll take care of it." Soft but firm. Enough to redirect the moment, to shield someone who didn't yet know how to stand in a room like this. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Claire said now, lifting her eyes again, steady, unhurried, and that steadiness seemed to irritate Vanessa more than any apology could have, because it didn't bend, didn't rush, didn't shrink. "There's no misunderstanding," Vanessa replied, her smile thin, practiced. "There's a standard here, and she clearly doesn't meet it." And the manager shifted, his weight, caught between the visible authority at table 12 and the quieter, less visible truth standing in front of him, his voice coming out lower than usual as he said, "Claire, maybe you should step away for a moment." A sentence that wasn't quite in order, but carried enough weight to feel like one. Claire didn't argue, didn't look around for support, because she already knew how this part usually went, how rooms like this protected comfort over fairness, how silence could be mistaken for agreement. But something in the air felt slightly different tonight, something she couldn't quite name yet, like a note held just a fraction too long. Near the window, at a table that had gone almost unnoticed all evening, a man with silver hair sat alone, his coffee untouched, his posture relaxed but attentive, the kind of stillness that wasn't absence but observation. And as Claire adjusted her grip on the tray, as the manager hesitated, as Vanessa waited for the final word that would remove an inconvenience from her evening, that man lifted his gaze for the first time, not speaking, not moving, just watching, and in that quiet, something shifted, subtle enough that most people missed it, but real enough that Claire felt it, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see who would decide what mattered next. The manager cleared his throat as if that Small sound could restore control to a room that no longer felt entirely his eyes flicking briefly toward Vanessa Cole before settling back on Claire, and in that hesitation was everything Claire needed to understand about how this would unfold if she said nothing. So she did not rush, did not shrink. She simply placed the tray down on the nearest service station with deliberate care, aligning it with the edge as though the world still followed rules that made sense. And when she turned back, her hands were empty, her posture unchanged, her voice quiet but anchored when she said, "I stepped in because he was being blamed for something that was not his fault." And for a moment the words hung there, simple, unadorned, without apology, and that simplicity made them harder to dismiss. Vanessa let out a soft, incredulous laugh, the kind that suggested she had already decided how this would end. "So now you are deciding what is fair at my table," she said, leaning slightly forward. Her tone polished but edged. "That is not your job." And Claire met her gaze, not challenging, not yielding, just present. "No, ma'am," she replied, "but making sure people are treated with respect is part of mine." And somewhere behind her, the young busboy stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, his hands clasped too tightly, his eyes fixed on the floor as if he could disappear into it. And Claire did not look back at him, but she did not need to. She could feel the weight of his fear in the space between them. Richard shifted in his seat, impatience now more visible. "We are not here for a lesson," he said flatly, glancing toward the manager. "We are here to enjoy our evening." And that was the sentence the manager had been waiting for, the one that tipped the scale, because enjoyment in a place like this often outweighed everything else, and he nodded once, more to himself than to anyone else, before stepping forward. "Claire, I am going to have to ask you to step off the floor," he said, the words careful, practiced, but final enough to draw a quiet ripple through the room. Claire inhaled slowly, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to steady the moment inside her, and when she spoke again, it was softer than before, but clearer. "If I leave, it will be because you believe I did something wrong," she said, her eyes on the manager now, not on Vanessa, not on Richard. "So I need to know that is what you believe." And the question, simple as it was, created a pause that did not belong to anyone, a space where certainty should have been but was not, and the manager opened his mouth, then closed it, his gaze drifting past Claire for the briefest second, toward the window, toward the man who had not yet spoken but had not missed a single word. The silver-haired man remained seated, his fingers resting lightly against the side of his cup, the coffee inside long gone cold, his expression unreadable but attentive in a way that suggested he was not merely observing the scene, but measuring it, weighing each decision as it unfolded, and Claire felt that awareness without fully understanding it, like a quiet current beneath the surface, something steady, something patient. "This is unnecessary," Vanessa said, her tone tightening now, that the moment was not resolving as quickly as she expected. "You are turning a small issue into something disruptive," and Claire nodded slightly, acknowledging the words without accepting their meaning. "It became disruptive when someone was blamed for something they did not do," she said, and then, just for a second, her eyes moved toward the busboy, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to include him, to make it clear that he was not invisible. Not in this moment, not here. The room shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle recalibration, as if the story everyone thought they were watching had quietly changed direction, and near the window, the man finally lifted his hand, not high, not urgent, just enough for it to be seen, and when he spoke, his voice did not cut through the room, it settled into it, calm, measured, impossible to ignore. "Before anyone steps away," he said, "I would like to understand what actually happened." And it was not a demand, not an order, but something about the way he said it made the manager straighten, made Richard's expression sharpen, made Vanessa pause just long enough for uncertainty to flicker beneath her composure, and Claire, standing in the center of it all, did not move, because for the first time since the spoon hit the floor, the moment no longer belonged to those who spoke the loudest. It belonged to the truth that had been waiting, quietly, to be heard. The room did not erupt after the man spoke. It narrowed, like every sound had been drawn inward and held there, and Claire felt it immediately, the shift from noise to attention, from assumption to scrutiny, as the manager straightened his jacket without realizing he was doing it, and Vanessa's fingers paused just above the stem of her glass, her expression still composed but no longer effortless. The man by the window did not raise his voice. He simply looked from one person to another as if he had all the time in the world and expected the same patience in return, and that alone unsettled the rhythm of the room, because urgency had been Vanessa's advantage, and now it was gone. "You said there was an interruption," he continued, his tone even, almost conversational, "and you said there was a mistake," and his gaze moved to Claire, not in challenge, but in invitation. "So let us hear both sides clearly." And Claire nodded once, not grateful, not relieved, just ready. Because clarity was something she trusted more than outcomes. "The spoon slipped," she said, her voice steady. "He is new. It was an accident. I stepped in before it became something worse." And she did not elaborate, did not defend herself beyond what was necessary, because she understood that truth did not need decoration to be understood, and for a moment, no one spoke. As if the simplicity of her answer had removed the usual places people hid, Vanessa let out a quiet breath, a smile. "Returning but tighter now. That is a very selective version of events," she said, turning slightly toward the man. "What actually happened is that your employee chose to correct me in the middle of my dinner, which is unacceptable in any establishment that values its guests," and the word guests lingered, heavy with implication, but the man did not react to it, not outwardly. He only tilted his head slightly, as if placing the word somewhere it could be examined later. "Did she correct you?" he asked, "or did she redirect a situation?" And the distinction was small, but it landed with precision, and for the first time, Vanessa hesitated, just a fraction, before answering. She interfered. And the man nodded slowly, absorbing the word rather than contesting it, and then his attention shifted, not to the manager, not to Richard, but to the space near the kitchen where the young busboy stood, still and silent. "And you?" the man said gently, not loudly, but clearly enough that the boy looked up as if pulled by the sound. "What do you remember?" And the question seemed to surprise everyone, because it was directed at the one person no one had thought to include, and the boy swallowed, his voice uncertain at first. "I dropped it, sir," he said, each word careful. "It was my fault, and she told me it was okay. She said she would handle it." And he glanced toward Claire, not seeking permission, just acknowledging her. "She did not embarrass anyone," he added, quieter now. "She just helped." And the words settled into the room differently than anything that had come before it, softer, but harder to dismiss. Richard shifted again, irritation edging into his tone. "This is becoming unnecessary," he said, looking directly at the man now. "We are discussing service standards, not training exercises." But the man did not respond to the challenge. He simply reached for his cup, turning it slightly in place, as if considering something far beyond the conversation itself, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that did not need to be announced. "Service," he said, "is not the absence of mistakes, it is how people respond to them." And the sentence moved through the room slowly, not as a correction, but as a redefinition. The manager felt it most, the subtle shift in ground beneath him, the realization that the decision he was about to make would no longer disappear into routine, and Claire stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, unchanged in posture, unchanged in tone, but no longer alone in the moment, because the truth she had chosen to stand on was no longer quiet. It had been heard, and now it was waiting to see who would stand with it. The silence did not break. It deepened, as if the room itself had leaned closer to the center of the moment, and the manager felt it pressing against him, the weight of expectation shifting from pleasing the loudest voice to answering something quieter but far more difficult to ignore. He glanced once more toward Vanessa, then toward Richard, searching for the familiar reassurance of authority, but what he found instead was uncertainty, thin and sharp beneath their composed expressions, because control had begun to slip in a way neither of them had planned for. "We are not questioning the importance of service," Vanessa said, her tone measured, each word chosen carefully now. "We are questioning the behavior of someone who overstepped, and she let the sentence settle, expecting it to regain the ground she had lost. But the man by the window did not respond immediately. He simply observed her, not with defiance, not with agreement, but with a kind of attention that made explanations feel incomplete. Overstepping, he repeated softly as if testing the word, suggests a boundary was crossed, and his gaze moved briefly to Claire, then back to Vanessa. So I would like to understand where that boundary is. And again, the simplicity of the question created a pause that could not be filled with confidence alone. Richard leaned forward this time, his voice firmer, less patient. The boundary is respect, he said. When we sit down in a place like this, we expect not to be corrected in front of others. And the man nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it entirely. Respect, he said again, quieter now, is often mistaken for silence. And the words did not accuse, they clarified, and that difference mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Claire stood still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her eyes steady, and for the first time since the moment began, the manager noticed something he had overlooked before. She was not trying to win. She was not trying to prove anything. She was simply refusing to step away from something she knew was right, and that realization unsettled him more than any argument could have, because it removed the usual options. There was no compromise to negotiate, no apology to request, only a decision to make. There are cameras, the man said then, almost as an afterthought, though it was anything but. I assume they are functioning. And the manager blinked, caught off guard by the shift from interpretation to evidence. Yes, sir, he replied automatically, they are. And the man inclined his head slightly. Then let's not rely on memory, he said. Let us rely on what actually occurred. And the suggestion was so reasonable, so grounded, that refusing it would have required an admission no one was prepared to make. Vanessa's expression tightened, just for a moment, a flicker of something beneath the surface. Calculation, perhaps, or the realization that the narrative she had controlled was about to be examined from a distance she could not influence, and Richard's jaw set, his earlier confidence now tempered by something more cautious, because facts, unlike impressions, did not bend easily. The manager hesitated, then nodded, signaling toward the back, and one of the staff members moved quickly, disappearing into the hallway that led to the office, and as they waited, the room held its breath again. But this time it was not anticipation of authority, it was anticipation of truth, and Claire did not move, did not speak. She simply stood in the center of it, as steady as she had been from the beginning, because whatever the cameras would show, she had already chosen her place in the story, and it was not one that could be erased by a single decision. Near the window, the man finally rose to his feet, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the balance of the room once more, and as he stepped forward, the faint reflection of the rain traced across the glass behind him, his presence no longer peripheral, no longer optional, and in that quiet movement, it became clear to everyone watching that the moment had moved beyond a complaint, beyond a mistake, into something far more revealing, not about service, not about standards, but about the kind of people they chose to be when no one expected them to prove it. The wait stretched longer than anyone expected, not because of delay, but because no one dared to fill it with the wrong words, and Claire could feel the shift in attention settling deeper into the room, no longer scattered, no longer uncertain, but focused, as if every person present understood that whatever came next would not simply resolve a complaint, it would define something larger. The manager stood near the service station, his hands clasped too tightly, his usual confidence replaced by a careful stillness, while Vanessa remained seated, her posture unchanged, her expression composed but sharpened at the edges, like glass under pressure, and Richard's gaze moved briefly toward the hallway, calculating, measuring, waiting for something he could still control. Near the kitchen entrance, the busboy had not moved, his shoulders tense, his eyes flicking once toward Claire, then away, as if unsure whether he was allowed to be seen, and Claire did not turn toward him, but her presence remained steady, unchanged, a quiet anchor in the center of a moment that had grown far beyond her. The man who had been sitting by the window now stood a few steps closer, not at the center, not taking the space, but no longer removed from it, his movements unhurried, his expression thoughtful, as if he had seen this kind of situation unfold many times before and was less interested in the outcome than in how people chose to arrive at it. "It is interesting," he said after a moment, his voice calm, carrying without effort, "how quickly a room decides who is replaceable." And the words did not accuse, they revealed, and for a second, no one responded, because responding would require acknowledging something no one wanted to say out loud. Vanessa's smile returned, controlled, practiced. "With all due respect," she said, her tone smooth but firmer now, "we are discussing standards, not philosophy," and the man inclined his head slightly, as if accepting the distinction, though not agreeing with it. "Standards are often a reflection of philosophy," he replied, "whether we choose to admit it or not." And again, the simplicity of his words made them difficult to dismiss. Footsteps approached from the hallway, quick but measured, and a young staff member reappeared, holding a small tablet with both hands as if it carried more than just footage, as if it carried the weight of the moment itself, and he handed it to the manager, who hesitated for the briefest second before turning the screen outward, angling it so the man could see, then Vanessa, then Richard, then finally Claire. The video played without sound, a silent reconstruction of what everyone thought they had already understood, the spoon slipping from the busboy's hand, the brief flash of panic in his posture, Vanessa's immediate reaction, sharp and dismissive, and then Claire stepping forward, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the moment, her hand steady, her voice unheard but clearly directed at the boy, not at the table, her attention focused on preventing something from becoming worse rather than assigning blame for what had already happened. The footage moved on, showing Vanessa's expression tightening, her words forming in quick succession, her gestures sharper than she likely remembered, and Claire standing still, not interrupting, not escalating, simply holding the line between mistake and humiliation. And when the video ended, the screen went dark again, reflecting only the faces gathered around it, faces that now had to reconcile what they believed with what they had seen. No one spoke at first, not even Vanessa, and in that silence, the truth did not need to be explained. It had already done its work, quietly, clearly, leaving no room for interpretation that did not feel forced. The man by the window looked at the screen for a moment longer, then lifted his gaze, not toward Claire, not toward the manager, but toward Vanessa and Richard, and when he spoke, his voice remained as calm as before, but something in it had shifted, not louder, not harsher, just more certain. "It seems," he said, "that the standard was met," and the sentence settled into the room with a finality that did not need emphasis, because for the first time since the spoon had hit the floor, the outcome no longer depended on who spoke the loudest. It depended on who was willing to accept what was already clear. No one reached for the tablet after the screen went dark, as if touching it again would risk changing what had already been made clear, and the manager slowly lowered it, his fingers loosening their grip just enough to betray the tension he could no longer hide, because the decision he had almost made now stood exposed, not just to the room, but to himself. Vanessa exhaled quietly, her composure returning in layers, practiced, controlled, but no longer effortless. "That footage does not capture tone," she said, her voice smooth, searching for ground that still felt solid, "and tone matters." And for a moment it seemed like the argument might continue, might stretch the moment further, but the man standing near the window did not look at the screen again. He looked at her, not sharply, not unkindly, just directly, and that directness made the space between words feel smaller, more precise. "It does," he agreed softly, "but so does intent." And he let the sentence settle, not as a correction but as a completion, something that closed the gap Vanessa had tried to reopen. Richard leaned back slightly, his expression tightening in a way that suggested calculation rather than frustration. "We are longtime supporters of this establishment," he said, his tone measured, deliberate, "and situations like this reflect poorly on management." And the manager felt the weight of that sentence immediately, the familiar pressure returning, the quiet reminder of influence and consequence. But before he could respond, the man stepped forward just enough to shift the focus again, not abruptly, not forcefully, but undeniably. "Support," the man said, is not measured by how often you are served, but by how you treat those who serve. And the words were simple, almost gentle, but they carried a weight that did not leave room for negotiation, and for the first time, Richard did not answer right away. The room held still again, not out of tension now, but out of recognition, because something fundamental had been named, something that could not be easily dismissed without exposing more than anyone intended. Claire remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her hands relaxed, her expression steady, and though the moment had shifted in her favor, she did not lean into it, did not claim it. She simply stood, as she had from the beginning, anchored to the same quiet certainty that had brought her here. The man turned slightly toward the manager, his gaze steady but not harsh. "You are about to make a decision," he said, "based on pressure rather than principle." And the manager swallowed, the truth of it settling heavier than any accusation, because it had not been spoken to embarrass him, it had been spoken to clarify what he already knew. "Yes, sir," the manager replied, his voice lower now, not out of fear, but out of recognition, and that small shift, that acknowledgement, changed something in the air, because accountability, once spoken, had a way of restoring balance. The man nodded once, accepting the answer, without extending it further, and then, for the first time, his attention moved fully to Claire, not as an observer, not as a distant presence, but as someone directly engaged in the moment, and there was no smile, no overt approval, just a quiet respect in the way he regarded her, as if he had been waiting to see whether she would hold her ground long enough for the truth to arrive on its own. "You did not raise your voice," he said, almost as an observation rather than praise, "and you did not step back," and Claire met his gaze, not searching, not uncertain, simply present. "There was no need to do either," she replied, her tone even, and the simplicity of her answer seemed to resonate more than anything else that had been said, because it carried no performance, no attempt to impress, only the quiet logic of someone who understood exactly where she stood. The man inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging something that did not need to be explained, and then he turned back to Vanessa and Richard, not confrontational, not dismissive, but final in a way that left little room for continuation. "This evening can continue," he said, "but not at the expense of someone else's dignity," and the sentence settled into the room with a calm authority that did not need to announce itself, because by now, everyone understood that the balance of power had already shifted, not through force, not through volume, but through something far quieter and far more difficult to ignore. For a brief moment, no one moved, as if the room itself was waiting to see who would accept the new reality and who would resist it, and Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass before she released it, her expression smoothing once more into something controlled, something presentable, but no longer unquestioned. "This has become unnecessarily dramatic," she said, her voice quieter now, measured in a different way. "We simply expected professionalism." And though the words sounded the same as before, they no longer carried the same certainty, because certainty had already been challenged, quietly but completely. Richard stood this time, slow and deliberate, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve as if reclaiming some part of the control that had slipped away. "We do not need to prolong this," he said, glancing briefly toward the manager, then toward the man who now stood between moments rather than outside them. "We will finish our evening elsewhere." And the statement was meant to restore distance, to re-establish choice, but instead it revealed something else, that leaving was now the only remaining way to preserve what had already been lost. The manager opened his mouth, instinctively ready to intervene, to retain the table, to repair what could still be repaired. But the words did not come, because for the first time, retention was no longer the priority, and that realization settled into him with a quiet finality. The man inclined his head slightly, neither encouraging nor preventing their decision. "That is, of course, your choice," he said, and nothing in his tone suggested loss, only acknowledgement, and that absence of urgency made the decision feel smaller than it was meant to be. Vanessa rose then, smoothing the front of her dress with careful precision, her movements composed, but slower than before, as if each step now required more intention, and she did not look at Claire as she spoke. "You may want to reconsider how you address guests in the future," she said, the words polished, but lighter now, no longer anchored by authority, and Claire did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of restraint, because not every statement required an answer. And when she did speak, her voice remained the same as it had been from the beginning, calm, clear, unshaken. "I always do," she said, and nothing more, because nothing more was needed. Richard turned toward the exit, Vanessa following beside him. Their departure quiet, almost ordinary, except for the way the room watched, not with curiosity now, but with understanding, as if everyone present had just witnessed something that would stay with them longer than the evening itself. The door opened, the sound of rain briefly returning, then closing again, leaving behind a silence that felt different, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved. The manager exhaled slowly, a breath he had been holding far longer than he realized, and turned toward Claire, his voice lower now, stripped of performance. "I am sorry," he said, the words simple, unadorned, and Claire met his gaze, not with surprise, not with triumph, just with acknowledgement. "I know," she replied, and in that exchange, something shifted that no policy could enforce, something built not on authority, but on recognition. Near the kitchen, the young busboy finally moved, stepping forward just enough to be seen, his voice hesitant but sincere. "Thank you," he said, looking at Claire, and she gave him a small nod. Nothing dramatic, nothing lingering, just enough to let him know he had been seen all along. The man who had been watching everything took a slow step back toward his table, his role in the moment already complete, as if he had never intended to stay at the center for longer than necessary, and as he reached for his chair, he paused briefly, his gaze returning once more to Claire, not searching, not questioning, just observing, as if confirming something he had already understood, and then, without another word, he sat down, lifting the cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, as if the temperature of it no longer mattered, because what he had come to see had already revealed itself. Quietly, exactly as it was meant to. The room did not return to normal right away. It adjusted slowly, like a space learning how to breathe again after holding too much for too long, and Claire moved first, not dramatically, not as someone stepping out of a spotlight, but as someone returning to where she had always belonged, reaching for the tray she had set down earlier, aligning it once more with quiet precision. Because small order was still something she could restore even when the larger moment had already passed. The low hum of conversation began to rise again, cautious at first, then steadier, as guests turned back to their tables, though not quite the same as before, their voices softer, their glances lingering just a little longer than necessary, as if they had all witnessed something they did not want to disturb by speaking too loudly. The manager remained where he was for a moment longer, watching Claire as she resumed her work, the simplicity of it striking him more than anything else that had happened, because she did not look different, did not carry herself with any new sense of importance. She simply continued, as if dignity had never required acknowledgement to exist. "Claire," he said quietly, stepping closer, his voice no longer carrying across the room, but meant only for her. "You can take a break if you need to," and she shook her head once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "I am fine," she replied, and there was no strain in her voice, no lingering tension, just the same steady calm that had held her from the beginning, and the manager nodded, not because he needed confirmation, but because he understood now that what she carried was not something that could be shaken by a single moment. Near the kitchen, the busboy moved again, this time with less hesitation. Picking up a clean set of utensils, his hands still careful but no longer trembling, and as he passed Claire, he slowed just enough to meet her eyes, offering a small, grateful smile that did not need words, and she returned it just as briefly, because some acknowledgments did not need to be spoken to be understood. Across the room, the man who had been sitting by the window lifted his cup, pausing for a second as if considering whether to drink from it, then setting it back down with a quiet, almost thoughtful gesture, and he watched Claire as she moved between tables, not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if what he had seen confirmed something he had been looking for long before he walked through the door. A few minutes passed, the rhythm of the restaurant gradually re-establishing itself, plates carried, glasses refilled, orders taken, and yet beneath it all, something had shifted, something subtle but lasting, like a line that had been drawn and could not be erased. The manager returned to his station, his posture straighter now, his movements more deliberate, as if aware that every decision, even the smallest one, carried more weight than he had previously allowed himself to consider, and for the first time that evening, he did not look toward the door, did not wonder about the guests who had left, because what remained felt more important than what had gone. Claire approached the window table then, not hurried, not hesitant, simply moving through her responsibilities as she always had, stopping just beside the man, her voice calm, professional, unchanged. "Would you like a fresh coffee, sir?" she asked, and he looked up at her, not surprised, not distant, but present in a way that suggested the moment was not entirely over, just quieter now, more focused, and after a brief pause, he gave a small nod. "Yes," he said, his tone even, "but only if you are the one who brings it." And there was something in the way he said it, not a request, not a test, but something closer to intention, and Claire inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. "Of course," she replied, before turning toward the service station, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, because whatever this moment had been, whatever it had revealed, it had not altered who she was, it had only made it visible to those who had finally chosen to see. Claire returned with a fresh coffee a few moments later, the steam rising gently in the soft light as she placed the cup in front of him with the same quiet precision she had shown all evening, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment did not require it. The man looked at the cup, then at her, his gaze steady, thoughtful, as if measuring something that had nothing to do with service and everything to do with what he had witnessed unfold. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried a weight that was not about the coffee itself, and Claire gave a small nod, her expression calm. "Of course," she replied, ready to step away as she would from any table, because to her, this was still just part of the job, not a turning point, not a performance. "Claire," he said then, stopping her gently, not with urgency, but with intention, and she paused, turning back slightly, her posture unchanged, her attention present. "Yes, sir," she answered, and he studied her for a moment longer, not searching for weakness, not testing her, but confirming something he had already begun to understand. "How long have you worked here?" he asked, and the question seemed simple, almost ordinary, but there was something beneath it, something quieter, and Claire answered without hesitation. "Just over a year," she said, her voice even. "Mostly evening shifts." And he nodded, absorbing the information as if it were part of a larger picture only he could see. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket then, not quickly, not dramatically, just a small, deliberate movement, and placed a simple card on the table between them, turning it so it faced her, and Claire's eyes moved to it, not immediately picking it up, just acknowledging its presence, because she had learned that not everything offered needed to be accepted right away. "If you ever consider doing something different," he said, his tone steady, "call that number." And there was no explanation attached, no promise, no pressure, just an open door presented without expectation, and Claire looked at the card for a moment longer before lifting her gaze back to him, her expression unchanged. "I appreciate that," she said, and there was sincerity in her voice, but also clarity, the kind that did not rush toward opportunity simply because it appeared. He gave a slight nod, as if that was exactly the answer he had expected, and then, after a brief pause, he added, "Most people in this room adjusted themselves to fit the moment," and his eyes met hers again. "You did not," and Claire held his gaze for a second, not as a challenge, not as agreement, just acknowledgement. "Some things are not meant to adjust," she replied quietly, and the words settled between them with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not loud, but lasting. He leaned back slightly in his chair then, a faint hint of something almost like a smile touching his expression, not amusement, but recognition. "No," he said softly, "they are not." And for a moment, The two of them simply existed in that shared understanding, a conversation that did not need to continue to be complete. Claire inclined her head once more, then turned away, moving back into the rhythm of the restaurant, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, because whatever had just happened did not redefine her. It only revealed her more clearly to those who had chosen to look. The card remained on the table for a moment before she returned to collect it, slipping it carefully into the pocket of her apron without drawing attention, not as a prize, not as a victory, but as something to be considered later. When the night had ended and the noise had faded, across the room, the manager watched. Quietly, no longer intervening, no longer directing, but observing with a new understanding of what leadership might require, and near the kitchen, the young busboy moved with more confidence now, his earlier fear replaced by something steadier, something learned without being taught. Outside, the rain continued to fall against the glass, soft, constant, and inside, the room carried on, conversations resuming, plates being cleared, the ordinary rhythm restored, but not unchanged, because somewhere between a fallen spoon and a quiet refusal to step back, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and long after the night would end, long after the tables were cleared and the lights dimmed, the lesson would remain, not spoken, not written, but understood by those who had seen it clearly, that dignity does not ask for permission, and when it stands its ground, even the loudest voices eventually fall silent around it.